Angels. Angels. What is angels? Is this an angel? Look, up in the sky, it's the angels coming to take you away so you don't have to suffer through the rest of this video. Don't worry guys, angels are really easy to understand. They're very straightforward and obvious. For instance, here are the three different types of angels. There's right angels, obtuse angels, and acute angels. Those are also things you can call your significant other. You can call him a cute angel, you can call him a right angel if you're British. Just don't call him an obtuse angel, that's probably not going to go over very well. Yes, if my energy and the fact that I'm not actively depressed right now didn't give it away, we're done talking about devils and demons and we're moving on to talking about something a lot more uplifting, angels. Welcome to Angels. This is episode 3 of 4 of the 4-part series that we're working on right now. And for whatever reason, this has turned out to be the most difficult one to research because we think of angels as being so integral to the Bible, to Christian religion, and to religion as a whole. All of us are familiar with angels in some way, shape, or form, and we have a great cultural idea of angels. But studying angels in the Bible is actually super frustrating because we don't really have a story of where they come from, and there doesn't seem to be a systematic theology of what they are. Basically, when an angel shows up, it appears on the stage, it does its thing, and then it disappears and is never really explained. Is it fun? Yes. Is it interesting? Also yes. Is it helpful to move the story along? Absolutely. Is it absolutely frustrating to study from an academic perspective? Yes. Yes, it is. So today we're going to try to talk about angels. Honestly, this is going to be one of the less systematic approaches that I've taken, purely because, again, the evidence is so fragmentary. I'm going to try to present some systematic theories and some ideas of how we should understand angels today, and looking at the history of the idea, of course, as we always do. But this is the one that, there just isn't a whole lot of data to work with. So I'm going to need you to bear with me on this one, but hopefully we'll make it interesting for everybody. I consider it my civic duty today to put the law in angelology. Yes, you're welcome. All right, first things first, and probably the reason you clicked on this video in the first place. Are biblically accurate angels really biblically accurate? And the answer is no, actually. Biblically accurate angels would look like this, or a little something like this. But what you're seeing here with the common representation in modern culture of biblically accurate angels is actually an attempt at representing the cherubim and the seraphim. Both of these are described as divine beings, which are throne guardians of Yahweh, the God of Israel, but in no case are they actually called angels. So yes, the Bible does depict spiritual beings that look more or less like this. But we'll talk about it later. But those creatures are never called angels. So biblically accurate cherubim, sure. Biblically accurate seraphim, maybe even that. But not biblically accurate angels. So what are angels, where do they come from, and what do they do? Let's talk about that more and look at some really biblically accurate angels. As I alluded to earlier, the Bible never actually gives us a systematic theology of angels. So as a result, what most people have done over the centuries and even in the modern day is they comb the Bible for every reference to an angel that they can find. They take whatever data they can from that and they put all of those lines of data together, and that's how we get our ideas of angels. I would personally suggest that if the Bible doesn't give us a theology of angels, then maybe we aren't supposed to think too hard about that topic. Regardless of whatever reality there is behind the angels, if we were supposed to know about it, I have a feeling that it would be found in the Bible somewhere. But instead, like I said, angels are like actors on a stage. They appear, they do their job, and they go home and collect their paycheck. One of the reasons I say we maybe shouldn't peer too deeply into these things is because some people, from ancient antiquity all the way up to modern day, and probably well into the future as well, get so wrapped up in the concept of angels that it distracts from studying God himself or having a relationship with God himself, if I can speak outside of academia for once. So it's one of those deals where anytime you introduce other divine beings apart from God, you risk, sort of diffracting the attention that could be paid to God towards these angelic figures. Now, if you want to study them from an academic perspective, that's one thing. But if you have sort of an unhealthy interest in them and it's affecting your spiritual life, that's a little bit of a problem. And as we're going to get into later, that was a problem in antiquity as well. Now, that's not saying that you shouldn't care about angels, that you shouldn't believe in angels or anything of that nature. I'm just trying to dissuade people from an unhealthy preoccupation with angels that distracts you from your relationship with God. We're going to be looking at a lot of different Hebrew texts and how they portray angels and how they understand angels to operate. But I do want to point out from the beginning that all of these texts were written over a broad span of time and in multiple different political contexts, and as well as being written in multiple different places geographically in the world. So because we have multiple different people writing about these things in multiple different places with multiple different events going on in the human world, sometimes we're going to get different perspectives on what exactly angels are. It seems that the ancient Israelites as well didn't possess a systematic theology of angels, so that you have to say this about them, but if you don't say that, then you're somehow engaging in heresy. there wasn't a system back then. And so when we have different documents written at different times in different places talking about angels, sometimes different perspectives on what angels are and what they do pop up from time to time. Again, it should be noted that in none of these texts is the rhetorical aim of the author to teach us about angels. The point that the author are making is about God and humankind, as pretty much always. They never sit down and say, okay, here's what you need to know about angels. As a result from that, modern Christians aren't beholden unto the assumptions that the ancients made about angels, but we are going to evaluate those assumptions as well. Essentially, the Bible contains documents written by different authors who probably held different opinions on what angels are and what their functions are. And Christians today aren't necessarily beholden unto any of those particular models, especially when they clash with each other. We can have a theory of angels today that's different from those, that's in continuity with those, it's based on those, any of those things. But like I said, there isn't like a dogmatic theology of angels that modern Christians are supposed to pick up on. I also apologize in advance because the structure of this video is going to be a little bit different than it has been for the last couple of videos that I've made. Usually I have a pretty decent structure figured out. We look at the oldest ideas in the Old Israelite period, then we move on to the Second Temple period, early Christianity, New Testament, and so on and so forth from there. This one, because it's so fragmentary and methodologically difficult, is going to be sort of a lazy river approach. We're just going to kind of move through the information as we can. So I apologize for the lack of structure, but consider it an adventure. Let's go see where this takes us. So just starting off, I want to point out the fact that angels, as these spiritual beings, is a uniquely Israelite phenomenon. What's interesting is that when we compare ancient Israelite culture to the cultures of the peoples around them, Mesopotamians, Egyptians, Hittites, Greeks, and so on and so forth, usually we can see a lot of similarities. There's similarities between, for instance, the tabernacle and Egyptian mobile temple units. There's parallels between the Temple of Solomon and the way people built temples in Northwest Semitic people groups and in Mesopotamia. And even in religious imagery itself, the way God is portrayed, we see similarities to Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Hittite, and Canaanite divine attributes. But what's interesting is that angels are exclusively Israelite. We see the idea of a divine messenger show up in various different ancient texts from various different ancient cultures. But the idea that there's a class of spiritual beings that function as angels is uniquely Israelite. And there's a lot of things that are uniquely Israelite. Every culture had its own absolute unique attributes, but angels are one of them for Israel. So that's kind of neat. So when angels do show up in the biblical text, very rarely is a lot of time spent on describing what they look like, but they tend to appear either as invisible forces that sometimes manifest themselves visibly to affect human beings, or else they appear in the form that's indistinguishable from human beings. Most of the time, they travel incognito. People interact with these angels and don't realize they're angels until they do something that confirms their identity as something beyond human. But in other cases, people have entire encounters with angels and never even realize that this is an angel that they're interacting with. This suggests to us that in the majority of cases, when an angel appears on the stage, it's walking around basically as a human being. You wouldn't be able to pick an angel out from a crowd of people. It's also worth noting, and I should probably just get this out of the way from the beginning, that angels are never depicted as having wings in the Old Testament or in the New Testament for that matter. I think the idea of wings being applied to angels comes from a conflation of the depictions of this cherubim and the seraphim, which do have wings and the many eyes, and again, biblically accurate angels, right? Conflating them with angels. So when you assume that cherubim are angels, you'll assume, oh, well, angels have wings as well, don't they? But angels are never depicted as having wings in the Old or New Testaments, and even for several centuries after that. This is a late antique or medieval development in depicting angels as having wings. So let's talk a little bit about what angels do. The Hebrew word for angel is malach, and malach can refer to a human or a divine person who serves as a messenger. So essentially, the Hebrew word for angel refers to a messenger. And in fact, this is what we find angels doing throughout the Old Testament. They're carrying messages from God to humankind and are enacting God's will on earth as his agents there. And this seems to be the primary function of angels as we encounter them in the biblical text. They're a way of allowing God's influence to reach earth without taking God out of heaven himself. They're his divine emissaries. They are intermediaries between the human realm and God's realm above. Ancient Israelite belief is that the God of Israel was the God of all creation. He's the king who rules over everything, which is appropriate since he's the one who, created everything. But because they spoke about God being a king, other elements of kingship came to be applied to God. What is a king, for instance, without having a court full of courtiers? And as a result, the nations surrounding Israel, the gods of those nations, came to be seen as the divine council of God. All of these people are subordinate kings to the over-rulership of God himself. So the God of Israel is the king of everything, but he has these subordinate kings who are ruling over the various nations around them, and these subordinate kings are the gods of the various nations. So, for instance, Cus, the Edomite god, might be seen as God's governor of the nation of Edom. Milcom, the god of the Ammonites, might be seen as God's employee, who's the governor of the land of the Ammonites. So angels seem to fit into the divine court imagery as being low-tier functionaries. They aren't the governors of the various nations around Israel, but instead they're divine messengers. They're meant to take messages from the divine realm and bring them down to the human realm, and possibly vice versa as well. So the role of angels probably fits within the divine council imagery that the Old Testament uses to describe God, the ultimate purpose of which is to emphasize the fact that God is king over all of creation. Did I write that? Naturally, however, understanding God to have a divine courtroom filled with other divine beings, especially beings who are engaged in the affairs of humankind, leads to a problem. You see, the Israelites were bound by the covenant to worship only Yahweh alone, the God of Israel. Although God was seen as the king of the divine council and therefore the governor of the whole universe, some ancient Israelites seem to have acknowledged the existence of the gods of the various nations around them. And so as a result of that, the threat of polytheism was always on the horizon. If you believe in the existence of these other deities in addition to the existence of God, then there's always going to be the temptation that maybe some respect ought to be paid to these other deities so that you can benefit from the circumstances that they represent. So in a sense, the divine council and the existence of angels, even if they're seen as God's employees, always carried with it the threat of polytheism. And remember, polytheism was a big problem in ancient Israel. This goes back to what I was saying earlier about how too much attention on angels can distract a person from their devotion to God. This is an old problem. Anytime you acknowledge spiritual beings besides God and start looking more and more into them and trying to find out how to interact with them, what their names are, what they do, and what they represent, you're taking some attention away from God a little bit there. And the same problem existed in the ancient world, although at a much higher magnitude. The idea that the divine council and angels pose a potentially polytheistic problem for the ancient Israelites is reflected in the antiquity of their literature. Among the four sources of the Pentateuch, the two oldest ones, J and E, both contain repeated references to angels. They show up all the time. They speak as God himself, and they carry out God's will on earth. But the two later sources, written at a time when polytheism was a much starker problem during the Josianic Reformation and thereabouts, we see angels scrubbed from the scene. They'll sometimes even retell the stories that we found in the J and E sources, but angels are conspicuously absent in their retelling. This suggests to us that in the later years of the Israelite monarchy, particularly during the time of Hezekiah and his grandson Josiah, that there was a intentional downplaying of the roles of angels and of other spiritual beings besides the God of Israel, because the mere existence of these beings and their presence could have coaxed the people into a sort of soft polytheism, or at the very least, it could have served as a sort of stepping stone to a hard polytheism. This actually makes a whole lot of sense with the development of Israel's history, because the D source consists of the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy has a complicated developmental history, but it was primarily composed during the reign of King Josiah. Josiah is remembered in the book of 2 Kings as being basically the best king that the southern kingdom of Israel ever experienced, and Josiah was known for what's called the Josianic Reformation. Essentially, a lot of Josiah's predecessors had been polytheists, even though they were supposed to worship God alone, the God of Israel alone, and Josiah marked a return to David's program of exclusive worship of Yahweh, the God of Israel. And so with Josiah's Reformation came the book of Deuteronomy, and if the book of Deuteronomy was indeed written during the Reformation of Josiah, then we would expect it to be placing heavy emphasis on the God of Israel alone and doing whatever it could to scrub away the polytheistic tendencies of the predecessors of Josiah himself. We see a similar tendency in what's called the priestly source, or the P source. This source contains no references to demons, to angels, to devils, or anything of that sort. It seems in the P source material, the divine realm is occupied exclusively by God. Now, the intermediary between God and humankind still needs to be there. If God is up in heaven and humankind is down here, then how is communication going to go that way? And the answer is through the cloud of glory. In the priestly source, we see the cloud of glory, which is somehow God and yet not God, descending into the camp, the tabernacle, to interact with humankind and convey God's plans. But this is sort of an abstract idea. It's a glowing cloud, perhaps a thundering cloud, represented that way instead of a humanoid angel being which could be worshipped separately from God. It seems to be something that's an aspect of God, something that's entangled with God himself, rather than a messenger who stands in God's place. So you get the idea of the messenger without the possible risk of polytheism. Despite the movement of biblical authors away from the more anthropomorphic representations of angels as the divine employees and the messengers of God, towards the idea of God representing himself in a sort of abstract, constellative manner, in the Second Temple period, the time after which the Old Testament was written, we do see the continuation of the divine courtroom motif. In Second Temple texts, gone are the idea of the rulers of the other nations around Israel as being the employees of God, and instead at this point, everyone in the divine council is just called an angel. Angel has sort of become a category at this time. This doesn't seem to have been the case in the Second Temple period, when angel or malach referred to something that these spiritual beings did. But in the Second Temple period, angel becomes something of a taxonomy. It's a species name. And so any divine being which is associated with God was put into the category of angel at this time. And so the divine council is still there in Second Temple literature. Places like the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and so on and so forth represent God sitting in his cosmic temple surrounded by angels who are rulers of various aspects of reality. And so because angel has become a category, and that category is distinct from the divine category that God is in, it's now okay to talk about angels a lot more. You don't have to worry about doing away with all the angels out of fear of polytheism, because now angels have become a species, and that species is distinct from God. God isn't the highest of the angels. God is species unique apart from the angels. And so you can talk about angels all you want without compromising and risking polytheism. At least ideally, because there are some references to angel cults popping up in some Second Temple literature. So Sefer HaRazim, for instance, is a early antique, late Christian period Jewish document which does inform us that angels were worshipped at some point by some people. And in the book of Colossians, written by the Apostle Paul, we see the worship of angels as something that he condemns in that book. There's also references to angels being sort of a quasi-deity status in syncretistic literature from Greek Egypt. So basically, Greeks living in Egypt wrote magic documents referring to angels as gods. There's a lot going on there. The Greek magic papyri deserves its own video, but it's interesting that we do see some references to polytheism with angels, thus confirming the fears that the people in the biblical period had, but it doesn't seem to have been particularly widespread. Angels were generally seen, at least within the sphere of Judaism and in early Christianity, as being a species or a taxonomy of divine beings which are subordinated to God. So there wasn't a whole lot of risk of polytheism at that point. And honestly, I'm really glad that angels came back on the scene because they make for really good plot points in literature. Probably the most famous example of Second Temple literature that involves angels is the Book of Tobit. Protestants, if you're looking for this book in your Bible, don't bother, it's not there. But to my Catholic and Anglican friends who have a Deuterocanon or the Apocrypha section, you will find the Book of Tobit therein. Tobit is a fantastic story. It was written sometime after the Old Testament was closed and before the New Testament was started, so probably around 250 BC, originally written in Aramaic, and it's the story of Tobit, or Tobias. There's complicated textual tradition there. But essentially, the story concerns a young man who has to travel from his homeland to Persia in the east, where he's going to marry someone from his own tribe and recover the family fortune and bring it back to his father, who has recently gone blind and can't take care of himself anymore. Along the way, Tobit is accompanied by a man named Raphael. Raphael appears to be an ordinary person from the same tribe as Tobit, the tribe of Naphtali, and he asks Tobit's father for permission to travel with Tobit to go recover the family fortune in return for a servant's wage. Throughout the story, it's revealed that Raphael, Tobit's traveling companion, is actually the angel Raphael, the archangel. You may remember him from the Book of Enoch or from other Second Temple literature, but Raphael is an angel who helps Tobit not only accomplish his task, save the princess and recover the family fortune, but also defeat the evil demon Asmodeus along the way. This is a wonderful story. It has a happy ending. It's really fun to read, and just all the different literary aspects of it. If you like ancient literature, please read the Book of Tobit. It's very, very fun. But what's interesting is that this also birthed the idea of the guardian angel concept. Maybe there wasn't a developed idea of guardian angels in Judaism at this time, but in early Christianity, we do see the idea of guardian angels start to develop very early. And to this day, Catholic Christians and a lot of high church Protestant Christians still believe in the idea that every Christian is allotted a guardian angel who watches over them. And a lot of that owes the roots of at least its depiction, if not its belief, to the Book of Tobit itself. Likewise, in the aforementioned Book of Enoch, angels play very prominent roles, especially in the Book of Watchers. We see different classes of angels. We're introduced to angels, archangels, and watchers. These angels carry out different functions in the cosmos. Some of them are in charge of making sure that the cosmic sphere orbits in the proper way, that the stars keep going the way they're supposed to, making sure that the rivers keep flowing. So they're identified with sort of forces of nature, at least in some of these regards. In other apocalyptic literature, like the book of Daniel, we see sort of the return of the governors of various nations being represented as angelic figures. They're not called angels in Daniel, but we do see the Prince of Greece and the Prince of Persia, not the video game, or the inferior movie. But we do see the idea of angelic spiritual beings as the governors of the various nations of the earth. So that's drawing on that older idea from the Old Testament period. Similar ideas to those found in Enoch show up in ascension texts. These are texts that depict the writer of the document going up into the various spheres of heaven, usually 7 to 9 of them. And in these various spheres, they meet different types of angels that live in each one. So angels in the sphere of the moon, angels in the sphere of Mercury, angels in the sphere of Venus. Hellenistic era cosmic geography is really complicated. We'll talk about it later. But what's interesting is we have the idea of the various ranks of heaven being organized according to the spheres of the planets. You know, the moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Sun. I think Jupiter and Saturn are the other two. And then the sphere of the stars that surrounds them all, and the prima mobile behind it. Basically, all these different levels of the cosmos are occupied by these different classes of angels that have different levels of glory and different functions in the cosmos themselves. Shows up in a lot of ascension texts, like the Testament of Levi or the Ascension of Isaiah. So angels sort of explode back onto the scene again in the Second Temple period because, again, no longer is there the risk of polytheism because they've been put into the category of angel. So they're used to explain things as broad as, cosmic operations and as simple as, hey, keeping you safe when you're going on a road trip. We see angels show up a few times in the New Testament, but it's really not all that often. For instance, when Jesus is tempted in the wilderness, it said that after that's done, angels come and tend to him. We don't know what that means. We don't really know a whole lot about what that involves, but it says it. Likewise, when Jesus is raised from the dead and the women go to the tomb, or when the disciples go to the tomb, depending on the story, they find 1 or 2 angels sitting where Jesus was laid to rest in the tomb. And so we have the idea of angels being there and announcing, again, serving as messengers, the truth of what's happened here, that Jesus has risen from the dead and he's gone ahead of his disciples, and that the dawn of the Messianic age has begun. They pop up a few more times in the book of Acts and a couple other places. Obviously, there's the book of Revelation, which talks about angels quite a lot. Again, Revelation needs its own series. Not touching it here. Just not going to happen. But angels show up a couple times in the New Testament, but not really all that much. Perspectives on angels were complicated in early Christianity, so I'm not going to lay out all the details here and trace its development fully. But it should be noted that a lot of us online these days encounter the idea of 9 choirs of angels. We see this show up in stories and art. It's kind of entered into the popular zeitgeist. And where did this come from? So the origins of the idea of 9 choirs of angels probably has its roots in the earlier Jewish ascension text literature, because again, there's 9 spheres of heaven with 9 different sets of angels living in all of those. But the systematic organization and the naming of these different types of angels actually goes back to around 500 AD with a writer named Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. We really got to bring back some of these old names. Like, I'm going to name my firstborn Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. It's not even a contest at this point. Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite was a Neoplatonic Christian philosopher. So Neoplatonism is a form of philosophy that's ultimately derived from Plato, but it takes on sort of a more unique personality to itself in the 3rd century with a Platonist teacher named Plotinus. So Plotinus so totally revolutionized the paradigm of Platonism that everything from Plotinus onwards is just called Neoplatonism. And Neoplatonism was really popular among early Christians because it was seen as being very compatible with their depictions of God that they get from the Bible itself. So it gave them language to talk about God philosophically in ways that, like, Stoic metaphysics or Epicurean metaphysics failed to do so. So it's not very surprising to see Neoplatonic or even just Old Platonic philosophers being able to use Christian language and vice versa very, very easily. So Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite seems to have scoured the Bible for references to different classes of angels. And here's where we see the conflation of angels and cherubim and seraphim into one category, although this probably happened earlier, even in the Second Temple period already. So basically, Pseudo-Dionysius found 9 different names for angels in the Bible and assumed that these were 9 different subspecies of angels. He then organized these into 9 different choirs in 3 different sets. So you have the bottom 3, the middle 3, and the upper 3. And if all that sounds familiar, it should, because this is the same organization that we find in Dante's Divine Comedy, specifically in Paradiso. 9 different layers of heaven with 9 different sets of angels throughout them. It seems that Dante was a very good student of Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. That's also what this little thing over here is. It's a map of Dante's Paradiso. I would tilt the camera down so you could see it, but again, I have recently moved, and so I don't want you to see the absolute mess that my office is right now. So maybe later. This idea actually entered into Western Christianity a long time before Dante with Pope Gregory the Great, who died around 600 AD, because in Gregory's writings we do find the idea of the 9 choirs of angels entering into Western Christian thought. He did ditch the 3 subsections of the choirs of angels, so instead of 3 sets of 3, there's just 9 choirs of angels, and that's also what we find in Dante's Paradiso as well. So now that we've kind of traced the general history of angels, let's talk a little bit more about what angels are. And I'm going to be focusing here explicitly on the Old Testament texts themselves, not focusing too much on the Second Temple text or the early Christian text. I want to know, in the earliest imagination of the Israelites, what are angels? This may seem like a moot point because I've already said that angels were parts of the divine council, but as it turns out, it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. Michael Hundley describes 3 different categories and models that scholars try to use to make sense of how angels show up in the Old Testament and what their relationship to God is. So Hundley talks about the interpolation model, the representation model, and the identity model. The interpolation model states that in the earliest versions of the Old Testament, instead of having angels, we actually have God himself appearing to people. So wherever we find an angel in the original text of the Old Testament, this was actually God himself appearing and interacting with people. But then in the Second Temple period, or maybe shortly before that time, scribes were really uneasy with the idea of God himself appearing to people, and so they changed the text to make it refer to angels instead. This used to be a pretty popular theory back in the 1900s and the late 1800s, but recently it's fallen out of favor for a couple of reasons. One of these being the fact that we've discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls and realized that the text of the Old Testament is actually a lot more stable than we previously thought it was. So if somebody did make such a modification, it would have had to have been at such a primordial time that it was probably the original authors doing it, and we don't have any evidence of that actually happening. On top of that, it's interesting that there are still times where God still does appear to people. So whoever was supposedly responsible for taking out the appearance of God to people and substituting angels missed a couple spots, which is kind of odd. So it seems to be unlikely. There's not really any evidence in favor of it. It was kind of an older, purely theoretical model that most people have willingly, thrown to the wayside these days. The representation model is something that we've been assuming this entire time. That's to say that angels are divine messengers who represent God when they appear on earth. So this view assumes that angels have independent personalities, they're divine beings or spirits, and they appear and interact with humankind, carrying out God's will, but having an independent identity and personality of their own as well. But there's actually a third model on the table, and this is the identity model. Now, what's interesting is that several times when angels show up in the Old Testament, they interchangeably refer to themselves as an angel and as God himself. So several times, when the angel of the Lord appears to somebody, it won't say the angel said to so-and-so, it will say God said to so-and-so when the angel is talking. And then it'll revert back to the angel said, and then it'll say God said. So it seems to switch back and forth between God speaking and the angel speaking. And so there's sort of a disconnect there, and scholars have argued for a long time on what's going on in those cases. The identity model solves this problem by suggesting that angels are sort of projections or manifestations of God. Rather than being an independent person walking around on its own, angels are actually more of like a hologram projected by God, sort of giving a form, usually humanoid, to interact with human beings and to convey information. But when that angel speaks, it's really God himself speaking. So it's more of a manifestation of God's presence localized in a particular place rather than an independent creature with its own thoughts and will. And this idea isn't actually new. The Sadducees, a party active during the Second Temple period and which feature in the New Testament of the Bible very frequently, seem to have held to a very similar view, and which was opposed by the Pharisees. Some scholars even think that this is actually a very old view that the Sadducees inherited from the Second Temple period or even earlier than that, but it's sort of unclear as to how that chain of tradition was handled. After laying out these 3 models, Hundley concludes with sort of a murky answer. Allow me to read straight from him. Hundley states, "It seems that their goal is not to provide clarity, but rather to leave the relationship between deity and messenger murky and variable. Such opacity serves their distinct theological agenda, namely to establish simultaneous presence and distance." This is to say that when biblical authors are using the figures of angels in their writings, they're using them to establish the fact that God is immanently present with the people that he's interacting with through the presence of the angel. Yet at the same time, there has to be a distance between God and humankind because of God's transcendence. God is in heaven, God is away from us, and yet he's interacting with us. So angels, again, aren't meant to be these systematic ideas of either they're this or they're that. They're functioning in the text to sort of make the connection that's necessary for God to interact with humankind while still leaving God's transcendence intact as well. So there might not be an answer to what angels are or how they should be understood properly. They seem to be intentionally liminal. They might just occupy this strange in-between space between personality and manifestation that we just can't really crack into all that much. So I'm sorry if you're looking for definitive answers on what angels are, but unfortunately I just have to conclude that we don't know what angels are. They might be spiritual personalities and persons in their own right, and they might also be manifestations or sort of theophanies of God that are manifested in particular instances in history itself. Or maybe there's some third thing between the two of them. We don't know. And again, we're not necessarily supposed to know, or at the very least, we don't have to know. Angels appear on the stage, they perform their duties, and they move along their way. That's kind of what they do in the biblical texts. As for what Christians today should think about angels, I think there's actually a room for a variety of different opinions on that. Remember, we have multiple different documents in the ancient world collected together into the Old Testament itself, and the perspective towards angels in these documents seems to be rather different. For instance, the E document that was incorporated into the Old Testament Pentateuch seems to believe that angels are active in the world. They're moving around everywhere. The P source for that same document, however, seems to restrict the divine realm to God alone. It doesn't like to talk about other spiritual beings apart from that. Likewise, there's different modern theories of what angels are. Some modern theories see them as projections of God, something that doesn't exactly have its own personality in and of itself, but is a theophany, a representation of God's power in human form. Likewise, a lot of other people can continue with the representation model, the idea that angels do have personalities and that they're basically persons, but in the spiritual realm, they don't possess concrete physical bodies of their own. I think there's room for multiple different opinions on what angels are within the church itself. There's room for P-source adjacent Christians and E-source adjacent Christians. Room for Christians who want to believe in a more filmed out divine realm, and those who are more comfortable with a sort of colder, more philosophical realm that places more emphasis on God himself. A great example of this polarity are the perspectives of Michael Heiser on the one hand and John Walton on the other hand. Michael Heiser believes that there is a very filled out spiritual world in the Bible, and that filled out spiritual world in the Bible should be adopted wholesale by Christians today. John Walton, on the other hand, suggests that the biblical worldview makes many assumptions about the spiritual realm that modern Christians aren't beholden unto. Both of these are excellent evangelical scholars, both of whose work I have enjoyed immensely, and I think there's room for both opinions in the church today. So in conclusion, the Bible doesn't give us a map of the divine realm or a systematic angelology, so I think there's some room for flexibility in what we think about angels and for there to be disagreement about angels. If you believe that there's angels, behind every corner, good for you. Go on believing that if that helps you. But if you're a little bit skeptical about angels, then that's okay too. I would say don't be too credulous or too skeptical. If you believe that there's an angel behind every single situation in life, or likewise a demon behind every situation in life, I think you're going to find places that don't have spiritual beings involved in them, and you're going to assume that there is a spiritual being at work there. You don't want to be hyper credulous about these things. At the same time, I would recommend not being hyper skeptical either. The fact of the matter is that humans are only capable of perceiving a very small amount of reality itself. I mean, even look at the visual light spectrum. Like, there's ultraviolet light coming off the sun right now, singeing my fragile ginger skin that I can't see. There are things that we aren't capable of experiencing. Maybe one day we will be, but right now we won't. So I'd suggest that if you want to be skeptical, something closer to agnosticism rather than pure skepticism would be preferable on that, but you do you. I can't tell you what to think. So thank you very much if you've made it all the way to the end of this video. We're finally free from the drudgery of talking about evil, Satan, and demons. I'm still just hyped to be out of that. So now we've talked about Satan, we've talked about demons, we've talked about angels. I wonder what number 4 could be. Can you imagine what number 4 could be if we've been talking about all these occupants of the divine realm in the biblical text itself, and there's sort of a big vacuum of something that we haven't talked about just yet? I wonder what that could be. So stay tuned for episode 4 in this series. Now, part 4 is going to be multiple parts. I tried compressing it into a single video. It's too big. So we're going to split it up into a couple of them. I'm trying to figure out which ones exactly I'm going to do first and kind of what the order I'm going to do this in. But that should be episode 1 of that sub-series, should be releasing next week. So stay tuned for that. and ensuing episodes on that topic coming out afterwards. As usual, if anybody has suggestions for topics they'd like to see covered, whether it's a particular book of the Bible, a story in the Bible itself, or an abstract concept, either from theology or biblical studies, let me know in the comments below. I'm always looking for new topics to talk about. The biblical world is a massive world. There's a lot of things to talk about there. But if you have an idea for something you'd like to see discussed in academic, painful detail, then feel free to leave it below. So anyways, thank you all so much for staying to the end of this. Take care, like, comment, and subscribe if you would like to, and I will see you all next time.